Before I get going, I want to take a moment and thank FlexXray for the invitation to speak at this forum and creating an environment for topics like this to be discussed. I feel that it's very important for our industry. I would also like to acknowledge the other presenters today, as there's been a lot of strong material shared, and that material will set the foundation for what I want to talk about today. So what I'm going to talk through isn't another piece of technology or a deep dive into a single event, but how foreign material issues are worked through in a real-life production environment. So the session intent's set up very deliberately. I'm going to walk through 3 different scenarios that are not during a mock audit, not during a exercise like that, but during real-life production when production pressure is real, resources are constrained, and people are trying to do the best they can in the moment. One thing I want to clearly delineate is management level decisions and that responsibility versus plant level execution. When there's a foreign material event at a plant or when that happens on the line, obviously a lot of attention is, hey, what happened there during production? But in reality, the decisions made earlier on by management influence quite a bit on what happens on the day-to-day behavior. I would also ask, as we walk through the scenarios, to think about your own organization, not defensively, but open and honestly. Where are we clear with our expectations? Where are we relying on individual judgment versus a formal structure? And where might there be system weaknesses that our people are compensating for that we don't know? One idea I want to anchor us on, not going to come to a surprise for everybody, any good foreign material control program is a multi-hurdle system, and effective systems use the same decision framework regardless of what the hazard is. So the 4 key components of this decision framework are, first, we got to start by asking what is the hazard and how will it realistically injure the consumer? Kind of like with this exercise we just went through, is it hard, is it sharp, is it embedded? What's the intended use of the product? What are the product characteristics? Second is detectability. Is the hazard detectable or not? If the object is detectable, that can create a false sense of security. If it's not detectable, then design and system governance need to do more of the heavy lifting. Third, what is the expectation, both from the regulator and the consumer? Not what has historically passed, but what is acceptable today. And finally, when the hazard first shows up, are we truly controlling it or just finding out about it now? And detection are not the same. So I won't belabor this slide too much. I think it's pretty obvious why this is important for material. We got a lot of good stats on why this is important and why it's one of the leading factors for recalls. But with foreign material, those events are pretty personal to the consumer. It's very visible as opposed to other types of failures. And then one of the uncomfortable things as I was putting this slide together and kind of reflecting on my own experience and some uncomfortable conversations, that most contamination is generally internally generated. Yes, there is an important component for the supplier and having those strong supplier programs, but if you really take a step back, most of the time it's something that we did to ourselves. And then finally, like it's been talked about, those early choices and those decisions, especially from the leadership level, drive the outcome. So how I'm going to use each of the scenarios. One, it's going to start with what's the management decision moment? What are the early items that were decided that's going to shape what's to come? Second, we'll see how that translates into plant level execution. Not to critique individuals, but how those signals that the plant is given is translated into day-to-day behavior. And then finally, we'll look at the early signals, those quiet indicators that will determine the outcome. So I'm going to start with plastic here. This is obviously a non-detectable hazard, largely. Plastic is everywhere in the food manufacturing environment. We heard fish hooks were the bane of existence. For me, blue plastic is the bane of my existence. So when with this too, these can feel low risk. It may not register with the same sense of urgency as glass or something hard and sharp. So here, I just want to start with kind of summarizing the timeline of where we're at in the scenario. So this is an extreme case. This is an AI-generated image just to provide for illustrative purposes. So let's say we have a component that looks like this within our plant. So right now, there isn't anything that's technically gone wrong yet. We don't have any consumer complaints. We don't have any threat of recall, and we don't have any regulatory intervention. But what has happened is much quieter and can blend into the background. Plastic components over time degrade. They may show wear, they may show minor cracking and discoloration. Also, another favorite thing of mine is temporary fixes. A workaround is approved just to keep production going. And this is the last low-cost opportunity that we have to intervene, because once plastic fragments and shaves off into the product stream, all those options go out the window, such as we can stop and force a product redesign, let's get a permanent fix in place, things like that. So this is where management level decisions are going to drive the outcome for what follows. With that example, are we going to treat that as one isolated piece of the line, or are we going to take a step back and see where we may have risks throughout our process and other parts of it? Do we approve a temporary fix, or do we pause and require a redesign? And then finally, setting escalation criteria. Is there a clear threshold that the teams and the plants understand that this has gone on long enough, and is everybody aligned on where that line truly sits? So again, plant level execution doesn't happen in a vacuum. It responds rationally to the signals it receives from leadership. Who has the authority to stop the line, or does the team feel pressure to keep product going? You know, we all say everybody is empowered to stop the line when they see something, but if you take a step back during what's the main topic that's talked about during team huddles, monthly meetings, all that, we talk about production throughput pounds. So subconsciously, that may kind of sit in the back of the operator's head. Secondly, was the temporary fix designed to last or just to get us through to the next shift? Then finally, if a new component is brought in, do we require a formal risk assessment, or is that bypassed because it seemed impractical in the time? And this is where culture begins to show up. So the key insight from plastic is inspection does not equal control. Again, not anything that's not obvious. There's no amount of visual awareness that can compensate for a fragile design. With non-detectable hazards, there needs to be strong programs and expectations put in place, otherwise you risk that fragmentation. You'd need to take, before the product, plastic fragments is when you really got to intervene. Second case study, I'm going to talk about a detectable hazard could be stainless steel, just pick your favorite one. This is largely detectable, so again, it can kind of create a false sense of security. We have many tools at our disposal that can find these objects. We have X-rays, metal detectors, magnets, and other things. But detectability can work against prevention. I'll get into that a little bit. So here in the timeline, again, there hasn't been anything that's drastically failed yet. You know, there's a trend beginning to form, but just subtly at first. Maybe it's one extra reject per shift. Maybe there's a pattern of after sanitation cycle or an equipment changeover. If you look at them individually, they seem explainable and they don't necessarily raise any alarms. So this is where, again, management level decisions are going to drive the outcome. Is there clear escalation criteria of when a trend needs to escalate beyond the site review? How quickly does maintenance need to respond to these trends? And is the expectation of the plant to actively look at the trend and challenge it, or is it just a simple routine documentation type of exercise? So again, plant level execution will follow the signals that they're getting from leadership. Again, are they required to really challenge and look at the trend and look at the failure modes, or is it just, again, we have to document the activity and move on? Secondly, when maintenance comes out to look at equipment, is the expectation just look for obvious damage, or should they look for equipment wear and probe deeper into other modes of failure? And finally, when there is a reject, is the decision to restart evidence-based, or is it just to log and to get going again? So the key insight from metal is all the tools we have are essential, but they should be treated as verification mechanisms, not preventative controls. Detection, if it's viewed through the lens of success, will push the teams to focus more on intercepting the object versus understanding why it's being generated in the first place. So because of this, maintenance schedules, equipment design, and integrity are the true food safety controls for this hazard. And finally, going to talk through bone, which is, again, poses a completely different challenge than the other two hazards. Bone is inherent to many products that are made, so it doesn't register as foreign in the same way. And because it's intrinsic and it feels inherent versus introduced, the mindset, if the wrong signals are given, can trigger something. We have to manage it rather than remove it from the process altogether. So again, this point in the timeline, maybe we're getting some repeat consumer complaints, but it's not in the same product. It may be from different customers or different products. Each occurrence feels explainable, right? It's bone, it's natural, it's inherent to the product. So because of that, if they're not pushed to work on it more, that'll delay the reassessment of the risk. Processes will remain the same, and that risk will still remain there. So management here needs to ask themselves questions that are more subjective, more than any other type of hazard. Are the thresholds that we thought were historically acceptable do they still count? How do we balance the regulatory, scientific thresholds versus brand reputation? And is all the cross-functional teams aligned on that expectation? Well, again, plant-level execution will mirror what they get from management. If leadership believes that bone is just a hazard to be managed rather than eliminated, the plant processes will follow suit. Training will focus more on awareness versus continuous improvement. And the investigation rigor will, again, be more about just controlling the hazard, so as long as we stay in historical norms versus really reducing it. So the key insight for me, looking at bone as natural does not mean acceptable. Just because historically it has been thought that way doesn't mean that we or the consumer is still going to tolerate that within their product. Consumer complaints, even though they are a lagging metric, they are a nice tool to signal whether perception of the product is changing. So now that I've walked through all three, I want to take a step back and look at all of them side by side to gain some insights. So with plastic or non-detectable hazards, the failures usually come in when there's not clear expectations and clear oversight of the components. Metal, if viewed through the lens of success, can continue to be generated within the system. Then with bone, it's assumption bias, assumption that what maybe was acceptable previously is no longer. The last couple slides, just want to touch on culture a bit, because I feel that it's important. Culture is not intent. Culture is not a value statement. Culture is not something that we hang on posters or talk about during annual meetings. It's the observable behavior that we see from our folks under pressure. So are we clear who has the authority and the confidence to stop the line? Do we have clear roles and responsibilities defined on who is to challenge assumptions, even those that have been there for years? And who owns trending and looking into those early signals and investigating before it escalates into a larger problem? So again, we talked about maturity models. This is kind of when I was thinking about it, looked at this and thinking about my own plants. In reactive cultures, right, actions driven by a single event, a single audit, really looking at that individually. Compliant cultures, systems exist, but they usually stop at meeting the minimum standards. If you'll dust off your GFSI certificate, right, and be like, oh, I'm all good to go, right? In preventative cultures, early signals are investigated before they escalate, and in embedded cultures, the decision discipline is the same no matter what the hazard is. So in full transparency, I'm not standing up here thinking that I'm at a 5. So last April, we had the unfortunate of a foreign material recall in some of our brought products. So that spurred a lot of internal thinking and evaluation. Last summer, we went through a gap assessment at all of our plants to kind of see where we sat on this, and I'll tell you, we were at a 2. So we've done a lot of work since then. We are probably averaged, we're about a 3, so we still got a lot of work to go, but need to use that as motivation to keep the momentum up within my organization in particular. Final takeaways is that obviously the contaminants differ, but the decision framework used should not. If different rules are given to different hazards, that just leads for risk of more repeat incidents. Early signals determine the outcomes. If we act on those early before we have fragmentation in plastic, if we truly dive into what's generating the hazard, we'll be in better shape. And lastly, culture determines the speed and depth of the response. All right, thank you.